Hi, everyone. We will be getting started in just a minute or two, waiting for things to get set up here, and we shall start shortly. Thanks. Uh-huh. I see. Okay. How do I do that? Okay, good.
Should probably ask if she's there. Gohar, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yes,
Okay.
I'm here.
Very good. Very good.
Wait a
Thank
minute,
you.
please. Just 1 minute.
Sure.
Very good.
And we're also waiting.
I'm trying now. I'm trying to change my name here. Wrote the Artak Shakaran. I'm trying to change the name. Sorry.
That's fine. No worries. We can't see you, Gohar, you know.
Oh, perfect.
Ah.
We can see you.
Now we can. Okay, and we're just waiting for our last panelist, David Lewis, to connect. He is having some sort of connection problem, and I'm sure is working on it. So I can begin with some introductory remarks, which will again buy us a few minutes. So I say to everyone, welcome. And my name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs at the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, NASR. Thank you for making the time to join us for this program today, or for that matter, to view it after the fact on YouTube, as a great number of people will be doing. I want to thank and recognize the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation for its support of our series of programs on contemporary Armenian issues, of which this is, I think, perhaps the final installment for 2021. So as this may be the last opportunity for me personally to speak with you this year, I would like to step outside of my usual role to make a request. In 2021, NASR has organized, hosted, or co-sponsored some 52 programs, lectures, panels, conferences, seminars, screenings. It does not take brilliant math skills, which is good since I don't have brilliant math skills, to work out that this averages out to about a program per week. But those are just numbers. And as one looks at the expanse of programs over the past year, one sees not just a lot of programs, but more importantly, a tremendous range of subjects being covered by these programs. Art and architecture, both their history and analysis, as well as their current, sometimes endangered condition. Language and literature, from medieval Armenian texts to current day memoirs exploring questions of identity. The deep past of Armenia as told by the archaeological record, and the current state of Armenia's politics and struggles. The Armenian genocide, both the historical record and its philosophical and ethical ramifications, and its denial. The role of women and feminist thought, both historically and today's world, in today's world. Cinema, performing arts, photography, and so on. I could continue, but we have a panel to get to today. What I'm driving at is this. For those of you who are NASR members and supporters, we thank you. This is what makes our work possible. For those of you who are not, please give serious consideration to becoming a member at a level you are comfortable with. Basic membership starts at $50 per year, which, again, if I may flaunt my math skills, works out to less than $1 per week or per event. We need your support now more than ever. And we thank you very much, and I thank you for hearing me out for a couple of minutes. We are very fortunate to have a distinguished panel with us today to take part in this discussion. And they're joining us from around the world, and all the more so when our final panelist joins us, which I very much hope he will. There he is. He's appearing now. Okay. Now I can start in good conscience to introduce our panelists. In alphabetical order, they are as follows. Dr. Gohar Iskandarian. Dr. Iskandarian is chair of our Iranian Studies in the Department of Oriental Studies at Yerevan State University in Armenia, having earlier served in various capacities at the National Academy of Sciences. Her research interests include domestic politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Iranian nuclear program and the problems around it, Iran's foreign policy, the dynamics of the relations between the Republic of Iran and the Republic of Armenia, and Iran's policies in the Middle East. Dr. David Lewis is Associate Professor in International Relations at the University of Exeter in the UK. He previously held posts at the Department of Peace Studies, the University of Bradford, and with the International Crisis Group in Central Asia and in Sri Lanka. His current research focuses on the use of illiberalism in global politics and comparative authoritarianism. His most recent book is Russia's New Authoritarianism, Putin and the Politics of Order, published by Edinburgh University Press last year, 2020. Dr. Carter Malkasian has extensive experience working in conflict zones, especially Afghanistan and Iraq, and has published several books. He was the special assistant for strategy to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 2015 to 2019. His 2013 book, War Comes to Garmser, 30 Years of Conflict on the Afghan Frontier, Oxford University Press, won the 2014 Silver Medal for the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Book Award, and his newest book, which undoubtedly you have seen enthusiastically reviewed all over the place, is The American War in Afghanistan, A History, published this fall by, again, Oxford University Press. Our moderator today is our stalwart colleague, friend, active member of NASR's Contemporary Issues Programming Committee, and I must add, also a newly elected member of NASR's Board of Directors, Dr. Anna Ohanyan, who is wearing all of those hats today. She is also the Richard B. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College, two-time Fulbright Scholar to the South Caucasus. Her publications include Russia Abroad, Driving Regional Fracture in Post-Communist Eurasia, Networked Regionalism as Conflict Management, and Armenia's Velvet Revolution, Authoritarian Decline and Civil Resistance in a Multipolar World. You've heard enough from me. I hand control over to Anna, and I remind the audience that you can use the Zoom Q&A function to ask questions of the panel, which I urge you to make brief and related to the issues under discussion today, and I will rejoin you at that time for the audience Q&A. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing from our entire panel.
Thank you so much, Mark, for organizing this event. And I've been really looking forward to this panel because of the very unique sets of expertise that we have represented in this panel, both geographically as well as the issue areas. So when Mark approached us to talk about Mark and actually Sarah Ignatius, when they approached to talk about the possibilities of discussing what does the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan mean for Armenia, immediately we thought of these three speakers, and the topic is so complex, multi-layered. So I thought initially how we're going to pull this together, but I started thinking about the expertise, so I'm really excited and looking forward to today's discussion. And indeed, the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan in many respects seems like a tectonic shift for regional and global security, but it also tragically feels like a geopolitical deja vu. For decades, Afghanistan has been stuck in between top-down modernization projects, which clashed, coexisted with informal and traditional institutions in the country for decades. And its political history very much has been defined by its role as a buffer zone between imperial powers. And Carter is the expert, observant, and analyst to talk about these issues. I'm really excited about having Carter on this panel. But this panel has developed to understand This panel is developed to understand the aftermath of the US pullout from Afghanistan. And in particular, it seeks to explain as to how the shifting geopolitics in the South Asia, the Middle East, and Central Asia impacts Armenia's foreign policy choices and statecraft. We have David Lewis, an expert in Central Asia, with whom I had the privilege of collaborating in the Russia Abroad edited volume, where David wrote a really insightful chapter on Central Asia. So we're trying to understand how the US pullout from Afghanistan and its aftermath will impact some of these regions, Central Asia in particular. But in many respects, this discussion, I would argue, is generalizable to understanding foreign policies of small states that are nested in fractured regions with very little regional economic connectivity, almost non-existent cooperation, coordination, and dare I say, institutionalization of political and security policy areas. As we're exiting the American hegemonic world order, many analysts and scholars are predicting turbulent times in global politics. The rise of regional and mostly liberal powers in the Eurasian continent is the wild card here. Do they have the political skill, legitimacy, and the political will to behave as responsible stewards on their neighborhoods? Or whether they will perpetuate regional fracture in the hopes of gaining leverage in global politics and domestic legitimacy. These issues are very relevant for Armenia, and we're privileged to have Gohar Iskandarian to talk about these issues, particularly focusing on Iran-Armenia dimension. And Gohar, again, Dr. Iskandarian is the go-to person, scholar on these issues in Armenia in the region. So I will, in terms of the format, we'll start with Carter, we'll then move to David to cover Central Asia, then we'll go to Gohar Iskandarian to talk about Armenia, domestic and the relations with Iran. There will be one round of Q&A that I will have with the panelists, or perhaps they will have questions to one another, after which we'll open it up to questions from the audience members. So it is my privilege to pass the baton to Carter.
Mark and Anna, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to talk to everyone today. What I thought I'd do right now is talk about how the collapse of the democratic government in Afghanistan and the assumption of power of the Taliban regime, how that affects a variety of issues and dynamics of regional significance. So I thought I'd talk about what it means for terrorism, thought I would talk about what it means for the US relationship with the Taliban regime. I thought hopefully I could talk a little bit about the economic situation and what implications that may have. Wanted to talk about the regional relations with the Taliban, and then I wanted to close with the US relations on the Middle East. So moving in that direction, terrorism. The Taliban are not the same thing as Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban themselves are not a terrorist organization. However, they have lots of ties to those organizations. And because of that, it's likely that we'll see a mildly increased risk of terrorism in the area. The Taliban have pledged in their agreement with the United States not to allow attacks to occur from Afghan soil onto other countries. And I think most of the regional countries that actually don't want to see attacks come out of Afghanistan. The issue here is the Taliban have lots of long-standing relationships with Al-Qaeda. They've fought with them through the years. They've received support from them. They've received money from them. In many respects, they consider them to be brothers in arms. During negotiations in Doha, which I was present in, it was clear that the Taliban had lots of concerns that if they broke too suddenly with Al-Qaeda, some of their members might go and work with the Islamic State, or some of their members might have problems with the Taliban leadership. So the question really is, how much are they going to clamp down on these groups? How much are they going to stop them from conducting activity? And we, I think, have to be a little bit uncertain about what that will be. And what that means is that there's some risk of terrorism coming out of Afghanistan again. I don't think that that terrorism will be of the magnitude of 9/11. And it's also unclear how long it will take for that kind of terrorism to manifest itself. So from a US point of view, I don't really consider it to be a great threat to the United States. It is, however, more of a concern, I think, regionally than it's a concern internationally. The region is much closer, much easier to be struck at. And some places are natural targets. Kashmir, India are natural targets. Pakistan itself could be feeling some degree of blowback due to its proximity. And it's not hard to think that certain Arab terrorist organizations might have reason to be in Afghanistan and then to conduct attacks in the Gulf states and other locations. So we do have this increased risk of terrorism. What would really accelerate it is if a full-blown civil war gets going in Afghanistan, in which case the Taliban might have to rely more on these kind of groups like Al-Qaeda, or a really drastic economic downturn. Both of those are things to look out for that could mean that the terrorist threat is more likely to appear, or could be a little bit greater magnitude than what I've kind of thought about here. So not wanting to pay attention to time, let's talk about what the United States relationship is likely to be with Afghanistan and the Taliban regime in the near future. So I think in Afghanistan at this point, given what President Biden has said, given how he said repeatedly the United States doesn't have interest in Afghanistan, I don't think the United States will be playing a leading role in Afghanistan and with relations with Afghanistan in the future. And there's a variety of reasons for this, in addition to what President Biden has said. For one thing, the Taliban aren't very likely to meet any conditions or any major conditions that the United States lays down. The United States Afghanistan doesn't very much want to form an inclusive government. The Taliban have shown that they don't have a lot of interest in that. In negotiations, it was clear that they want to make sure that their government has an Islamic foundation, and they were a little bit skeptical of including outsiders. The Taliban are likely to be very demanding in negotiations for anything that the United States would want to do in return for a relationship. And a group that's demanding in negotiations is also demanding of senior leadership time. And senior leaders don't have a lot of time for something they don't consider to be a major interest. We also, what's really important to note here, are the domestic costs in the United States to cooperation with the Taliban. That even something as small as recognizing the regime could cause domestic criticism of the Biden administration. And doing things such as providing lots of economic assistance would probably generate even more criticism. So that's also a natural constraint on a meaningful a deep U.S. relationship with the Taliban regime, or a U.S. position where it's trying to lead the world in their position with the Taliban. But with that said, I'd also want to say that I don't necessarily think that the United States is going to treat the Taliban regime as a pariah, nor do I think I would endorse that. The Taliban, the United States probably will have to establish diplomatic relations in one way, and to a certain extent, they've already done that through Qatar, which will be representing U.S. interests in Afghanistan in the near term. And I also think it's likely the United States will provide some humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, because I think the United States has concern about the welfare of the people there and what could be happening and what looks to be like a future downturn. And I don't think the United States will impede other countries from doing that. But the factors that I mentioned before, the obstacles that I mentioned before, are likely to prevent the United States from playing a leading role or having a really deep relationship there. So in terms of the economic situation, I think we're already seeing Afghanistan moving towards a recession. They're already in a recession. The question right now is just how deep and how bad will it be? This is fed by the drawing up of international assistance funds that the government and their civil service depended on a great deal. At the same time, we're going to have a large number of fighters who were employed in war before and were not going to be employed in war in the future, most likely. And then we have lots of challenges for international investors to invest in Afghanistan. And those challenges come from the security situation, they come from corruption, they come from the lack of infrastructure, and they come from the lack of laws that guarantee an investor is going to be able to reap the benefits of their investments. But on the other hand, there's some reason to think that Afghanistan might not collapse entirely. Some of these are, on the one hand, the Taliban have much greater access to revenue right now than they had in the future. There's much greater land that they can cultivate for poppy that they couldn't cultivate previously. They have much greater access to customs points, which are a traditional area to get revenue from. And the average Afghan also is now living in a situation where there is less war. It's easier for a farmer to get goods to market. It's easier for bazaars to operate. Life is less hard in that regard. So I think a recession is likely. Again, the scale of that becomes a little bit harder to estimate at this point. All right. What about regional relationships with the new Taliban regime? So in the short term, I think that there's a good amount of common interest about what should be happening in Afghanistan. Common interest in that all the various neighbors would like to see stability in Afghanistan. They don't want to see a terrorist threat coming out of Afghanistan. They also don't want to see the Islamic State, which has a small number of fighters, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000, operating in Afghanistan. They don't want to see the Islamic State gain power. Iran doesn't want to see the Islamic State attacking Iran. Pakistan doesn't want to see it attacking them. And Russia doesn't want to see it attacking it or any of the Central Asian states. So there's some common interest there in allowing the Taliban regime to exist, to giving them some existence, some support so they can maintain stability in the area. But over the long term, I think competition is probably going to become more evident. I think it's going to be hard to keep down competition in Afghanistan. It's hard to think of a country which has several middle powers and two great powers, maybe three great powers close to it, standing in the middle of these countries. It seems hard to see how competition isn't going to emerge between those countries over the longer term. US departure removes a common enemy. All these countries had a tendency to turn the other cheek toward the or turn their eyes away from the Taliban, or even give them some support beneath the table, because the United States was there. But the United States is gone now, and Pakistan, Russia, Iran, India, China, they don't all have common interests in this regard. Pakistan is very closely aligned with the Taliban. The Taliban are not do not follow the orders of Pakistan. But as Taliban rule and Pakistan gains more influence, that's a natural friction point with Iran. It's a natural friction point with Russia. Iran has its own concerns with protecting Shia inside of Afghanistan. Russia has concerns with protecting Tajiks and Uzbeks in Afghanistan. And as the Taliban have a government that doesn't include others, as in a country with lots of land and water problems, as clashes naturally emerge between these various groups, there will be lots of temptation for the outside powers to get involved with proxies, try to secure their interests, or try to undermine the efforts of other countries in there. What China is going to do is a little unclear here, as so many things are unclear. China has so far tried to keep away from Afghanistan, to not get terribly involved. I think they will certainly want to try to avoid a quagmire there. But they're kind of a wild card in terms of what's going to happen in the future. One thing is definitely clear here. The Taliban will play the other countries off each other. The Taliban will use these competing interests to try to get more assistance from each side. This is a traditional game that Afghan regimes have played, and that many countries in this kind of position end up playing. So I think that's something we can look to with some certainty. Let me go on to the last point here. The last point is regarding the US relationships with the Middle East. So in spite of what's happened in Afghanistan, I think the United States will continue to play a leading role in the Middle East. Now, the role in the Caucasus, that's a little bit different. I think the role there would be less amplified than in the Middle East itself. But US interests in the Middle East are much stronger than in Afghanistan. The United States, whereas the United States has few interests in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, it has many. The terrorist threat coming from the Middle East is greater than in Afghanistan, so that is a reason to stay involved. The Islamic State still exists in a latent state. The United States has deep interest in regional stability and balance in the Middle East, ensuring that no single country dominates over everything. And I don't think it's saying anything surprising to say the United States has lots of concerns about Iran in that regard. The current administration also views partnerships and alliances as fundamental to strategy. So it's not likely that they were going to want to abandon Middle Eastern alliances and partnerships. So the United States will keep an eye on that. And I think it's likely the United States will sustain its military presence in Iraq and Syria. And so that will be a continuing position. I'd especially expect the United States to continue its relationship with the Kurds, certainly the KRG in northern Iraq, and probably also the Syrian Kurds as well. Although the Syrian Kurds have a little bit more controversial in that regard. I think the United States will look to cooperate with the Middle East on Afghanistan in terms of migration and Afghans fleeing Afghanistan, especially Afghans who we think would be persecuted by the Taliban regime. I think we're looking for cooperation there. I think for intelligence cooperation on counterterrorism specifically will be an area of interest. And for some countries, as being an interlocutor with the Taliban. I don't really think that Armenia necessarily follows in that place. But other countries do. They can more easily talk to the Taliban regime and easily serve to pass concerns, interests back and forth. Now, with the natural friction points between the United States and Middle Eastern states, there's differing interests here. Middle Eastern states have a much greater concern about migration than the United States has. The Middle Eastern states are also closer to terrorism than the United States is. The Middle Eastern states have to worry about how the balance in Afghanistan actually works out and what kind of violence could be emerging from it in a way that the United States doesn't have to worry about. But those are all my points. I realize I talked probably 12 minutes, which is 2 minutes over what I was supposed to do. I apologize for that. But thanks for the opportunity to chat on these things, and I look forward to questions.
Sure. Thanks so much, Carter. You covered so much ground in 12 minutes. Before I turn it over to David, one question I will leave you. So perhaps when we come back, perhaps we could start with that question. You mentioned, you actually started your presentation with that and closed with it, that United States will not treat the Taliban regime as a pariah, but also will not extend full engagement with it. And that in this process, the role of interlocutor states will emerge. So it sounds to me that United States might be outsourcing its engagement with Afghanistan to third countries. My worry is, for example, if we look at Turkey, who was working eagerly trying to control the airport, have control and manage the airport, could you comment in the Q&A as to whether this elevates Turkey's role for United States in dealings with Afghanistan or not? So that's one question. And if there's time, perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more, the propensity, the likelihood of a civil war, that it is a multi-ethnic state. There are conditions for civil war, external meddling, etc., very similar to sub-Saharan Africa in some respects, I would argue. So just two questions so we could get to it. So let's move to David Lewis. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I hope you can hear me okay. I had a few IT problems. That was a great start, I think, to our discussion. And I want to come a little bit with a bit more on Central Asia and perhaps on Russia as well, which is really an area I'm focusing on a lot at the moment. So I think Afghanistan has that, the events in Afghanistan have this sense of a really pivotal moment historically. And yet, since August, of course, we've seen only a very slow and gradual sort of growing impact, perhaps, of the new regime. And particularly that's noticeable in the region to its north in Central Asia, where although there've been lots of discussion of the various reactions of Central Asian states, in reality, the impact so far on everyday lives, on politics, has been relatively limited. So that's going to change gradually over time. It's going to change in some quite big ways, I think. So I thought, let's start perhaps at the highest possible level, sort of the big geopolitics of the region. Anna has talked about in the past, has written this excellent book on the idea of fragmented regions, and Central Asia is a very typical region in which fragmentation is deeply part of the politics of the region. These are countries that typically do not cooperate on key issues, particularly on security. They favor hard borders between themselves. They're broadly authoritarian regimes with some minor exceptions. And those kind of regions give lots of play for external powers to play their geopolitical games within the region. For Russia, of course, this is its former empire. These are Soviet republics. And even to this day, for Russia, that southern border with Tajikistan and Afghanistan, the most porous of the northern Afghan borders probably, is still seen as the southern strategic flank for Russia. Once you cross that border, you have very porous borders going up to Russia. So Russia sees any movement, for example, of refugees from Afghanistan into Tajikistan or Uzbekistan as essentially a potential security threat to itself. So Russia obviously has military still located in Tajikistan. So this is the forepost, if you like, of Russian strategic reach down onto its southeastern flank. So Russia is never present in the region, but for a number of years now, there's been particularly among Western analysts, I think, the idea that Russia's influence is in decline, that gradually it's being pushed out of the region. I think it's fair to say you've seen that in the South Caucasus as well over the years, this idea that Russia no longer is going to play a critical role. And Afghanistan proves once again that although Russia has various weaknesses in its toolbox, particularly on the economic front, nevertheless, it remains the primary military security power in the region. And therefore, all these states have to deal with Russia, and they deal with Russia in different ways, but they always factor it into their foreign policy calculations. Of course, the big challenger to Russia has been China. China is now the biggest trading partner for Central Asian states, the biggest investor in the region, and really is the key hope for many Central Asian states to develop, to modernize, to find some way out of this post-Soviet economic malaise that has really affected the region. And for many, China is also potentially the solution to the problem of Afghanistan. The idea that you can get infrastructure, connectivity built with Chinese help, that really gives some hope to Central Asian states that they will be hubs for transport connectivity across the region, rather than, as it is at the moment, a kind of economic dead end beyond which it's quite hard to move in terms of trade. But there are problems for both Russia and China in the region, and Afghanistan sort of sums that up. Lots of the initial responses to those dreadful pictures from Kabul when the United States and NATO forces were withdrawing were that this was a golden opportunity now for Russia and China to leap into this power vacuum, to make the most of this geopolitical opportunity. But look at it from the point of view of Moscow and Beijing. To be honest, it looks a lot more like a rather unpleasant headache on their southern flank than a major breakthrough geopolitically. They're left with a really difficult conflict that they do not have the capacity to resolve. And so they're responding primarily defensively, as we just heard, trying to manage the situation rather than really find ways to take advantage of it. Russia is doubling down on its presence in Central Asia. Partly that's for genuine security reasons, trying to bolster its position against any kind of overspill of violence. But it's also part of a Russian policy that we see across the former Soviet Union, which is about reconsolidating Russian influence. We see it in the Southern Caucasus, we see it in the tensions around Ukraine and Belarus, and we see it in Central Asia as well, where Russia wants to maintain or indeed enhance its position as a major power and a regional hegemon. And Afghanistan, to a certain extent, is the excuse for Russian reassertion of its military presence in the region. The big challenge for Russia, of course, is managing any security issues that emerge from that. But at the moment, I think it feels that its engagement with the Taliban is sufficient to maintain a lid on any potential cross-border overspill. But we're in a very early period of Taliban rule. And as we just heard, the prospects for different scenarios are really high. And I would also be interested to hear the answer to the question of whether there will be civil war. That's certainly the fear across the region, is that civil war is seen as much more dangerous than the Taliban regime. It's that instability that can generate violence that might cross boundaries. But I think it's worth just thinking about how states in a region like Central Asia manage these kind of major historical transitions and these shifting geopolitical tectonic plates. And there maybe you can also read across to Armenia and to the Southern Caucasus. How do small states that are squeezed by major powers try and maneuver among them? And I think Central Asian states are past masters at trying to manage these difficult relations and maintain some element of a multi-vector foreign policy in which they can ensure that not all their geopolitical eggs are in one basket. So a country like Tajikistan, on the one hand, in the immediate post-Soviet period, appeared to be almost entirely a Russian client state, essentially, but it's used its relations with China in particular to leverage some distance. And then, in the last few months, we've seen it balancing its relations with Russia and China with this quite assertive anti-Taliban stance from President Rahmon. And that stance has gained it a certain amount of international engagement and international reaction. Seen President Rahmon make a visit to Europe in the last couple of months. In other words, Tajikistan is playing that traditional game. We're trying to triangulate foreign policy to make sure that even though there's a Russian base there, even though large numbers of Tajiks work in Russia, and therefore is highly dependent on those remittances, nevertheless, Tajikistan keeps some freedom of maneuver in its foreign policy by engaging with the West, by engaging with China economically. And the same we see across the region. So Kazakhstan, one of Russia's closest allies, of course, member of the CSTO, member of the Eurasian Economic Union, but still a country that manages to maintain very good relations with the West and build up its economic relations with the European Union. Lots of foreign investors from the West as well. So this is a very interesting experience, I think, to compare across the former Soviet space. And when you see a major shift like the one we've seen in Afghanistan, countries react in different ways, but the most astute leaderships are those who manage to maneuver between these great powers and not get squeezed by any or all of them at the same time. That's difficult to do, but I think we've seen in the different reactions to Afghanistan the ability of small states, nevertheless, to maintain some kind of autonomy. Tajikistan has been very strong in its opposition to the Taliban. Uzbekistan, on the other hand, has clearly found a way to engage with the Taliban, open up channels of communication. Turkmenistan, in the same kind of way, trying to build up business links. Both of them have big infrastructure projects they want to do in Afghanistan. So it's all about very careful diplomacy, managing your own national interests, and Central Asians have a lot of experience of that over 30 years of independence. And I think we will see them continue to play that careful maneuvering game in what is becoming a very difficult and potentially dangerous geopolitics across Eurasia. So I will leave it there and pass back to Anna. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Before this is very good. This is an excellent discussion. Before I transfer it over to Gohad, I wanted to leave you with the following question that I'm hoping you can return during the Q&A. On the one hand, you mentioned, and I agree to a certain extent, that Russia is trying to consolidate its presence in the post-Soviet spaces. But at the same time, looking at Russia, Central Asia from the Afghanistan angle, it can also look like a case of imperial overreach. These post-Soviet spaces have all kinds of internal problems, and particularly in South Caucasus, they seem to show the limits of Russian power to a certain extent. So I'm hoping that in the Q&A, you can comment a little bit, how does Russia balance its desire, the Kremlin, to exert influence in these regions without having to deal with this imperial overreach problem that many countries also have to, actually great powers find themselves in. So let's now, thank you very much, David. This is excellent and good to see you again, by the way. Let me transfer it to Gohad. Gohad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for having me on this panel. The Islamic Republic of Iran recognized the independence of Armenia in 1991. From this point on, Iran reserves the full right to take steps to expand its influence, both in Armenia and in the other countries of the Caucasus. I should note that Turkey also got involved into this race. These two major powers in the Middle East engaged into an under the carpet conflict. And Turkey, that was not only representing its own interest in the region, but also those of the West, put much effort to block the spread of Iranian influence. With Putin coming to the power and seeing strengthening of the Russian Empire, the balance of power in the region become more obvious. During the First Artsakh War, Iran sometimes acted as a mediator and succeeded to resolve certain issues, but we should note that the Iranian authorities have always supported the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. But it is one thing to make an official statement, it is another thing what was in their own interest. It was obvious that when the border territories of the Kofsakan and Jirakan were under the control of Armenian forces, Iran did not keep so many army forces along this part of the border. This is a sign of the trust between two nations. However, during the recent war, Iran adopted only an observing policy as it had no legal right to interfere in any action. During the first days of the war, Iran was the only single way for weapons import to Armenia. But from the middle of the war, Iran paid tribute to the Turkish-Azerbaijani pressure and taking into account the complaints of its Turkic citizens living in northern Iran, closed this last road. At the same time, the Iranian army was joined by Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Heavy equipment approached the border, which, according to our information, is still standing along a border. I would like to clarify the official position of Iran on this issue. During the last war, Iran called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and invited to sit at the negotiation table. Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif stated that they had an option developed for the talks, which, by the way, was very similar to 3+3 program currently on the table. Both options intend to push the United States out of this issue, hence the region. During the war, Iran failed to assess the situation correctly, leaving its natural ally, Armenia, alone. As a result of this, Tehran lost both political and economic interests, significantly endangering its security due to the presence of Turkey, Israel, and jihadists in Azerbaijan, and especially in the border areas of Iran. After the signing of a ceasefire, Iran clearly realized that from now on they have the task of better protecting Iran's northern border and that they are left out of the development in the Caucasus. This was the reason for Iran's more active engagements during 2021. In March 2021, the ambassador of India to take spoke of plans to connect Iran's Chabahar port in the Indian Ocean with Eurasia up to Helsinki through Armenia, creating the North-South Highway. In our opinion, this program mostly contains a political sublayer. It should have opened the door to new opportunity for Armenia, which Azerbaijan is skillfully trying to prevent with its attack on Syunik, excluding a security guarantee. After the war, Iran began to show signs of activity to try to reposition itself and find its place in the condition of new realities. However, the new realities are not in Iran's favor. There was a severe tension in the relation between Azerbaijan and Iran, which had potential of escalation of clashes. Second, the belief of Armenian society that Iran would somehow, even in its own interest, intervene in the exciting problem gradually faded away. Unfortunately, this was even voiced on Armenian public television through a few experts in Iranian studies, which created a certain atmosphere in the country. Third, before taking any action, Iran first of all discusses it with Russia, agreeing on their positions. In other words, it is obvious that Iran thinks that the decision-making takes place just in Moscow. Even today, we notice that the construction of the North and South Highway is again being hindered by Russia, not allowing the functioning of the only road coming through Syunik. To be clear, after the war, new Russian forces were deployed through Syunik, and every Armenian citizen hoped that any new provocation by Azerbaijan would be faced by Russia based on alliance responsibility. However, during a provocative intervention by Azerbaijan in November 2021, Russian forces located near the Sisian airport, about 5 miles to the point of contact, did not carry out any operation to stop the Azeris coming in the direction of Sisian. Only after Iranian President Raisi and Putin had a telephone conversation, and when, in effect, Iran reiterated its official position and the direct request of Russian Defense Minister Shoigu, Azerbaijan stopped its advance. The existence of this corridor worries Iran as well because, in fact, the only highway that connects Iran through Armenia to Europe will be crossed by this corridor. As for Europe or the United States, during the 44-day war, we have seen largely declarative statements, no substantial support for either war prevention or humanitarian catastrophe or any action on defense of human rights. Thus, a reality was fixed. The totalitarian regime of Azerbaijan attacked, and as of today, it intensifies an atmosphere of fear for neighboring countries, which in 2018 took the path of democracy, received high marks from the Western democracies. At the same time, Russia and Iran, which are considered by the same democracy as rogue countries, are becoming the guarantee of the existence of the natural security of the state that took the path of that democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gohar. This is a lot, again, on the table. The question I have for you has to do with the North-South corridor that you're talking about, and Iran, India, Iran, Armenia, Georgia, all of that connectivity. And I'm hoping you can elaborate a little. If I understood you correctly, you're saying that Iran is interested, and obviously Armenia is a stakeholder and an interested party in that North-South connectivity, but Russia essentially is blocking that. So if you could tell us a little bit more on that. Do we have any evidence? What is Armenia's diplomacy in that regard? How is Armenia balancing Russia and the West and Iran? And this is a very complex regional scenario here. So I'm hoping we can talk about the corridor, but let me go to Carter, and then we'll go to David, and we'll come back to you. Go ahead, and then we'll open for Q&A.
All right, great. So your first question was, does the U.S. desire to have or interest in having an interlocutor, does that give Turkey opportunities? Well, perhaps it does give Turkey opportunities, but I think that some of the other countries in the region are better positioned than Turkey is. The Gulf states, for one, already have pre-existing connections with the Taliban. And the Taliban have lived in those regions for a long period of time. They know the diplomats there. We've already turned to Qatar for that kind of mediation and transfer of information. So the Gulf states are a little bit better positioned than Turkey is. Turkey does have natural ties into Afghanistan, especially to the Uzbek and the Turkmen communities. And Afghans do tend to look at Turkey more fondly than they do other countries, largely because of the relationship that they had with Turkey and the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, and then later on in the Second World War. But Turkey also has to worry. Turkey's position there also doesn't compare to like the position of Russia, the position of Pakistan, the position of Iran. So it's not. It has some ability to do things, but it also has some challenges that it would face if it really wanted to be an effective interlocutor and be there for a long time. You then asked about the likelihood of a civil war. So in the near term, there's some factors that are militating against a civil war. And so first of all is the absence of a resistance. The groups that the people were looking to fight the Taliban, the government forces, the old Northern Alliance, they've all collapsed. And there's no known government fighting group or Northern Alliance fighting group in the country right now. Now that could change, but I think it'll take a little bit of time for that to change. Now, the Islamic State is fighting, and perhaps to a greater intensity than was expected. However, the Islamic State is fairly small. It's kind of focused in certain provinces, and it can conduct terrorist attacks and be an irritation. But I think pushing the country into a full-scale civil war, I think that will take some time if the Islamic State is going to develop into that kind of threat. And then the other thing about the militates against it in the short term is Taliban cohesion. The Taliban have been and continue to be a fairly cohesive organization. They've always been more cohesive than the government was. Recent reports that there was differences in fighting in between them, I think there's some truth to that. But in the aftermath of that, they've remained together. Haven't been further reports of difficulties. And these groups, the Haqqanis and the mainstream Taliban, they fought together since 1994. So I think that cohesion is probably going to remain. Longer term, as you, Anna, pointed out, Afghanistan does have the characteristics of a country that gets into a civil war. It has rough terrain. It's likely to continue to go through an economic recession. It has regional powers that will have inclination to intervene there. And with us gone, again, there's a lack of a common enemy that affects not just the region, but affects the Taliban themselves. To the degree to which the Taliban were united to remove an occupier, the removal may allow there to be greater splits that over time can undermine their cohesion. So over the long term, possibilities exist.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carter. David, back to you.
Yeah, thanks. You asked an interesting question about Russian influence. I think you're seeing quite interesting contradictory tendencies at the same time. So on the one hand, lots of these societies in Central Asia are much less connected to Russia. There's a new generation there which hasn't studied in Russia, has fewer connections there. They travel in the West. You mentioned Turkey. Turkey is obviously also a key sort of cultural lodestar for some people in the region. Many go and study in China. So it's a much more complicated national sort of nation building program going on. And Russia is struggling to keep up with that process of social change. And you see that in, Russian occasional interventions when they feel the Russian language is being downgraded in some way, or their cultural interests are not being respected. But at the same time, as you have that process going on, you've also got a process whereby Russia's military and security and geopolitical influence in the region is at least being maintained, but I would argue also probably being increased. So these two things are going in different directions, and that creates some certain tensions, I think, which have yet to come to the surface, but I think will be there in the future. And I think, you can see some parallels in other parts of the former Soviet Union, including perhaps in the South Caucasus as well. So I do think that's an important process. Within that, of course, Russia is also competing all the time with the West in various ways. And I think it is worth just reflecting on the sense that the West is obviously has left Afghanistan in the most dramatic way, but also in the rest of the region, the idea that a Western orientation would be somehow a really significant part of modernization for Central Asia is no longer a given. This is very different from the 1990s, when it was just assumed that, Washington and Europe were the direction of travel, that although these were authoritarian states, that at some point there would be a liberalization, right? There would be more democracy in the region. Very few people in Central Asia see that anymore. These are very consolidated resilient authoritarian regimes, and there's very little expectation that that will change in the near future. So we see a very different reality in which Western influence, broadly understood, has been sidelined and marginalized. It's still there, but it's a completely different picture from 2 decades ago. We're dealing with a genuinely multipolar situation on the ground. Russia, China, the Gulf states, Turkey you mentioned as an increasingly important player, I think. India, a whole range of non-Western states who increasingly set the agenda, call the shots, and have really significant influence across the region.
Very good. Thank you so very much, David. That was great. Let's move to Gohad. Gohad, floor is yours.
Duran, with your permission, I will answer your question in Armenian languages.
Sure.
Ուրեմն այսպես,
Gohad, do you want? So yeah, you speak in Armenian, maybe 2-3 sentences, and I'll translate.
Yes, thank you. Ինչով է պայմանավորված ձեր հարցի հետ կապված Ռուսաստանի ուրեմն խոչընդոտումը հյուսիս-հարավի ծրագրին։ Կապված է այն հարցի հետ, որտեղ հյուսիս-հարավը 2 ճանապարհով պետք է անցնի։ Մեկը պետք է անցնի Իրանից Ադրբեջան եւ մտնի Ռուսաստանի Դաշնություն, իսկ Հայաստանի ճանապարհը Չաբահարից պետք է, որը ուրեմն Իրանի նավահանգիստ է, այդտեղից պետք է մտնի Հայաստանի Հանրապետություն, այնուհետև Վրաստան եւ փաստորեն Վրաստանից Սև ծովով գնա Եվրոպա, այսինքն ստացվում է, որ Ռուսաստանի Դաշնությանը մենք շրջանցում ենք։
Okay. So this is important. Let me translate that very quickly. So I asked the question as to why and whether Russia is an obstacle for Armenia to capitalize on a north-south roadway. So Gohad is saying that yes, it is, and the answer is the following. The reason is the following: that there are 2 ways for this connectivity to work. One route is connection between Iran, Azerbaijan, and Russia. That route, and the other one is from Iran through Armenia, Georgia, and Europe, which essentially bypasses Russia.
Երկրորդ հարցը, թե ինչպես է փորձում Հայաստանի դիվանագիտությունը բալանսավորել Ռուսաստանի այսչափ ներգրավվածությունը Հայաստանում, պետք է նշենք, որ բալանսավորումը այս կառավարության շրջանակներում այնքան էլ չի ստացվում, եթե ժամանակին կարողանում էին եւ Արևմուտքի հետ համագործակցել եւ Ռուսաստանի ներգրավվածությունը նվազեցնել, փաստացի այսօրվա իշխանությունները ամբողջովին տրված են Ռուսաստանի Դաշնության կամքին եւ միայն երբեմն հայտարարությունների մակարդակով են փորձում բալանսավորել այն, բայց իրական կյանքում մենք տեսնում ենք, որ Ռուսաստանը ել ավելի ներգրավված է Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունում, հաշվի առնելով այն զինված ուժերը, որոնք այսօր առկա են Հայաստանի Հանրապետության ողջ երկայնքով մեկ։
My second question to Gohar was, to what extent is the Armenian diplomacy able to balance Russian influence in the country and in the region? So Gohar is saying that the current government is not doing much balancing of Russia. While it used to be, there were periods when Armenia was able to balance Russia with other actors, but that now, and I'm assuming Gohar means post-war, but perhaps you can clarify that not much balancing is happening. Perhaps at the level of statements, the government will kind of try to make statements, but overall, Russia is much more fully embedded in the region, also assessed by the fact that it has troops throughout all of Armenia's borders. So not much balancing is happening.
Եվ խնդիրը կայանում է նրանով, որ նաև պատերազմի ընթացքում ժողովուրդն էլ հասկացավ, որ փաստացի ոչ արևմուտքը, իդեմս Եվրոպայի, ոչ էլ Միացյալ Նահանգների էական որևէ արձագանք չցուցաբերեցին, եւ սա է հիմնական պատճառը, որ հասարակության մեջ էլ արմատանում է այն խնդիրը, որ այո, մենք պետք է համագործակցենք միայն ու միայն Ռուսաստանի Դաշնության եւ փաստացի Իրանի հետ, որտեղ նրանք են այսօրվա մեր գոյության հիմնական երաշխավորները։
Gohar is also adding that this sort of Russia has a greater presence in Armenia, partly because of the way the West, Europe, and the United States have behaved during the war, meaning that they have not provided any security, did not play much of a security role for Armenia. This only elevated the public perception in Armenia that Russia and Iran are only regional powers that can provide some assurance for Armenia's physical security. Go ahead, but I was sensing that there's at least some anti-Russian sentiments publicly. That's even during the presidential snap elections, listening to the public debate, it was interesting to hear that which never was the case, there was players that were campaigning on policies that they were calling for push against Russia. Is the public so fully behind Russia, do you think?
Ոչ, իրականում կան բավական շատ խմբեր, որոնք հակառուսական տրամադրություններ ունեն, բայց երբ որ հարցադրումներ են արվում, եթե մենք հեռանում ենք Ռուսաստանից, թիկունք ենք դարձում Ռուսաստանին, ապա ինչ ուժեր են մեր ֆիզիկական գոյության ապահովման գրավականը տալու։ Այդտեղ չի լինում արդեն որևէ լոգի, այսինքն որևէ պատասխան չի լինում։
Yeah. So So Gohad is saying that there are certain pockets and segments that are questioning, that are very critical of Armenia's alliance with Russia, but at the same time, as questions emerge as to what would Armenia do if Armenia turns completely, does a U-turn from Russia, it's essentially the nakedness of Armenia's security becomes pretty obvious, and these conversations, I'm assuming, do not go anywhere. There's not much support, I guess. I guess that's what you're saying.
Իրականում պետք է նշեմ նաև, որ հանրության մեջ բավական ծանրակշիռ դեր է զբաղեցնում այն հատվածը, ովքեր որ գտնում են, որ առանց Ռուսաստանի թույլտվության այս պատերազմը չէր կարող լինել, բայց այլ հարց է, որ պատերազմից հետո մեր գոյության, անվտանգության ապահովումը փաստացի կապվում է կրկին միայն Ռուսաստանի հետ։
There are many segments within the Armenian public that are convinced that this war, the last year's 44-day war, would not have happened without Russian permission. But at the same time, the same people also realize that Armenia's physical security still continues to be dependent on the Kremlin. Thank you very much, Gohad. Let me see, I have not checked. I'm not seeing any questions yet in the Q&A in the chat box.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. And in the meantime, I have a couple that I would like to pose to anyone who would care to address them. One is regarding Afghanistan's support for Azerbaijan. It has been vocally, if not necessarily, I'm not sure, materially supportive of Azerbaijan last year. At the time of the war and subsequently. So of course that predates the change of government in Afghanistan. Of course, going back to the 1990s, Mujahideen from Afghanistan participated in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh at that time. What significance does the relationship between Azerbaijan and Afghanistan really have, and what at base is the nature of this relationship? Is it just talk, or is there substance behind it? That's question one. And I'll welcome any responses.
So I can start, and I suspect Gohar or David may have a much better understanding than I do about the exact details of the Afghan relationship, such as it was with Azerbaijan. But so if there's future conflict or future violence, the Taliban will have to decide carefully what they want to do. Part of the reason that the Taliban have credibility, or some kind, they don't have credibility, but that regional countries aren't terribly worried about them yet, is because the Taliban have said repeatedly that we will not threaten other countries, that we will be neutral, that we're going to care about Afghanistan, and we're not going to get involved in the other politics that are going on. So if a conflict breaks out and they say, and they instead take a side, and let alone send fighters to participate in it, that will change the viewpoint of the region about what the Taliban regime is and what kind of threat they might be. Now, the other thing to point out here is that if Azerbaijan in a war with Armenia, that the Taliban would certainly have a hard time condemning that war, condemning the Azerbaijan in any kind of way whatsoever. And there would be a certain ideological incentive to support Azerbaijan, it morally, if not in actuality, because of what the nature of that conflict would be. So I'll stop there.
David and Goha, do you have any information, anything to add on Afghanistan-Azerbaijan connection?
Not too much detail, but I mean, I think it's fair to say that Afghanistan will be focused almost entirely on internal, on internal events going forward. And I think the main driver was probably Pakistan's relationship with Azerbaijan, which has always been pretty close. So I suspect that the Taliban, even more than the previous Afghan government, will be entirely focused on anything that's going on inside its borders. That could change, of course, if, for example, it feels it needs to send a message to the world or somehow put pressure on the region. Then it could start trying to play a slightly bigger regional role, but I think that's very unlikely in the next few months. So I think those connections are going to be not even in their top priorities going forward. So, but it's definitely an interesting, at least historical question now. We'll see if it comes back on the agenda in the future.
Good.
You've touched on my second question, which was regarding the Pakistan relationship with Azerbaijan on the one hand and Turkey on the other, which I gather has not been entirely without its ups and downs as well. And then on the flip side, Armenia and its attempts to forge a closer relationship with India. How do these non-intersecting lines affect Armenia in particular, but regionally? I see Gohar was nodding as well.
Do you want to take that, Gohar?
Շնորհակալություն հարցի համար։ Ուրեմն մենք պետք է արձանագրենք երկու կարևոր փաստ, որ 44-օրյա պատերազմը դա միայն հայ-ադրբեջանական պատերազմ չէր, այլ այս պատերազմի մեջ ներգրաված էր ինչպես Թուրքիան, այնպես էլ Պակիստանը։ Եվ Պակիստանի
So we have to state the fact that the 44-day war was not a war between only Armenia and Azerbaijan, that both Pakistan and Turkey were involved on the side of Azerbaijan.
Եվ պետք է արձանագրենք, որ Պակիստանի ուրեմն ազդեցությունը բավական մեծանում էր Ադրբեջանում։ Մենք տեսանք բազմաթիվ անգամ ցույցերին, անգամ Պակիստանի դրոշի բարձրացումը Ադրբեջանում, Իսրայելի դրոշի բարձրացումը, եւ հենց սրանից հետո էր, որ Հնդկաստանը փորձում է ակտիվանալ Հայաստանում, հաշվի առնելով մենք շատ լավ գիտենք Պակիստան-Հնդկաստան խնդիրների մասին։
During the war, the influence and the visibility of Pakistan publicly in Azerbaijan was growing. We were seeing the flags of Pakistan as well as Israel. And it is in this context that India started becoming more present, expressing more interest in relations with Armenia, considering India-Pakistan rivalry.
Երկրորդ հարցին, որ կցանկանայի անդրադառնալ, դա այն հանգամանքն է, որ Միացյալ Նահանգների զորքերի դուրս գալուց հետո Աֆղանստանից փաստացի առաջացավ վակուում, եւ այս վակումը փորձում է լցնել ինչպես Թուրքիան, այնպես էլ Իրանը։
So another factor to state is that after the US pullout from Afghanistan, there is a regional vacuum, which currently two powers are trying to fill, Turkey and Iran. Right, that's what you said. Go ahead, Turkey and Iran.
Turkey and Iran, yes. Եվ մենք տեսանք, որ մի շարք դեսպանատներ Աֆղանստանում փակվեցին, բայց ոչ Թուրքիայի, ոչ էլ Իրանի դեսպանատները չփակվեցին, եւ նրանք փորձում են համագործակցել Թալիբան ուժերի հետ։
After the pullout, many embassies in Afghanistan have closed down, but the embassies for Turkey and Iran have stayed open, and both of these countries, the governments are trying to build relations with the Taliban government, the Taliban regime.
Հաստատի մենք ականատես ենք դառնում, որ տարածաշրջանում լուրջ փոփոխություններ են գրանցվում, ուժերի բալանսների փոփոխություն է գրանցվում, հատկապես Միացյալ Նահանգների տարածաշրջանից դուրս գալու հնարավորության դեպքում այս ուժերի բալանսը էականորեն փոփոխվելու է։
What we're seeing is that the balance of power between various forces is shifting and that the US pullout is accelerating the change of this balancing of relations between various regional powers.
Արձանագրենք, որ Իրանը, չունենալով այնքան միջոցներ, որքան Թուրքիան ունի, փորձում է այլ կերպ բալանսավորել, դիցոք 2016 թվականին ռազմավարական պայմանագիր կնքեցին Չինաստանի հետ, որը էականորեն մեծացրեց տարածաշրջանում Իրանի ազդեցությունը։
So I'm not sure if I understood. Go ahead. So you're saying in 2016, Iran and China signed an agreement which elevated Iran's role in the region or China's
Yes.
role? Iran's role
Iran.
in the region. Yeah, because of its connection with China. Very good. Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
There is a question, speaking of China, that touches on that. How does Armenia's evolving relationship with India affect Armenia's relationship with China, or does it?
Իրականում ես կփորձեի պատասխանել միայն Իրանի հետ կապված հարցերին, սա իմ հետաքրքրությունների ոլորտից մի փոքր դուրս է, բայց եւ այնպես նշենք, որ Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունը փորձում է Չինաստանի հետ եւս ակտիվ համագործակցել եւ այս համագործակցությունը ավելի շատ միջնորդավորված է, դա լինում է Իրանի եւ կամ Ռուսաստանի միջոցով։ Ավելի շատ այդպես է։
Gohar is very modestly claiming that this is a little bit outside of her expertise, but she's noting that Armenia is trying actually to elevate and improve relations with China as well as India, but that this relationship seems to be mediated through Russia or what was the second country you said?
Or Iran.
Or Iran, yeah. So essentially it's trying to elevate relations with China through Iran as well as Russia.
Okay, another question. How to best understand Russia's diplomacy towards small nations of former Soviet space? Is it engagement with no military commitment or maintaining balance of power among these nations to benefit Russia's status in the region or regions?
David, would you like to take that? That is tailored for you.
That sounds like it's teed up for David, yes.
Well, it's a very complicated answer to a short question. I mean, essentially, this is a Russian historical search for strategic depth around its borders, which has been there for many years in Russian foreign policy thinking. It wants to maintain its regional hegemony, its ability to be the major power in the region, and going along with that, it wants to exclude those countries that it sees as strategic opponents from its neighborhood. So, one of the big concerns for Russia in Central Asia has always been trying to keep the United States out of the region, particularly pertinent in 2000s when the US had military bases there, of course. So a lot of Russian pressure was to push those military bases out of the region. Seen the same ideas coming up in the last few months about potential US bases in Central Asia. Again, Russia pushing very hard to keep those out. So Russia's all about pushing back the West from its neighborhood and trying to maintain its own strategic.
I think we lost
dominance of its neighbors. So am I still on?
You're back.
Hear me?
Yes, I think that came through. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good.
So I will share a non-question, which I will turn into a question from Canada. The comment is that Armenia is foolish to trust the West and needs to get the newest technological weapons from Russia. like hypersonic weapons, Orion drones, etc. But the current government is not stepping up to Russia's offers. I will ask for comments on that. And also my question is, does Armenia have other options in the region for military, not military partnerships, but perhaps for purchasing military technologies, or is it Russia or nothing? And I turn to Gohar and Anna for this.
Gohar is going to take it.
Հարցի համար թերևս այո Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունը այս պահին չունի այլընտրանք ռուսական զենքի համար եւ մենք տեսնում ենք որտեվ այս տարիների ընթացքում ամենաէժան զենքն էլ Հայաստանը հենց գնել է Ռուսաստանի Դաշնությունից եւ այո մեր հիմնական
sorry, go ahead. So yes, indeed, Armenia does not have a lot of alternatives to in purchasing military equipment other than Russia. But perhaps, Gohar, if you could qualify political alternatives or financial alternatives. Because the Russian weapons were cheaper.
Ամենաէժան զենքն է եղել, որ գնել է Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունը Ռուսաստանի Դաշնությունից եւ այո մենք չունենք մեծ հաշվով այլ ալտերնատիվներ.
So these weapons have been the cheapest ones on the market for Armenia. But could politically, was it possible for Armenia to also look for alternative sources, assuming hypothetically that finances are not an issue? Go ahead. Yeah.
Իհարկե, եթե մենք ունենայինք ավելի մեծ գումարներ, բնականաբար Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունը կբազմազանեցներ իր զենքի տեսակները, գնելով նաև արևմտյան որոշ տեսակի զենքեր, ուրեմն 44-օրյա պատերազմից առաջ որոշակի քանակի զենքի տեսակներ գնել էին նաև արևմտյան որոշ երկրներից, այսինքն միայն ռուսական զենքերը չէր, ունեինք նաև չինական որոշակի տեսակի զենքեր, այսինքն մինչ այդ Հայաստանը փորձել է
Armenia, before the war, has tried to diversify its military purchases and has purchased weapons from other countries as well. But again, if I'm understanding, it is primarily the financial limitations are a concern for Armenia right now in terms of its inability to diversify its military purchases.
Դրանք եղել են որոշակի քանակի, այսինքն դրանք հիմնական գերակշռող զենքեր չեն եղել եւ դրա համար է որ Ռուսաստանի Դաշնությունը որոշակի նման թույլտվություններ տվել է, որպեսզի Հայաստանը կարողանա նման զենքի տեսակներ ձեռք բերել։ Այսինքն հիմնական առյուծի բաժինը այնուամենայնիվ եղել է ռուսական զենքի տեսակները։
Even though Armenia purchased some weapons from other countries, these were largely marginal in terms of technological impact that they have. So this is the reason as to why Russia allowed Armenia to make these purchases. Otherwise, the political issue also would be a concern. What emerges from Gohar's analysis.
Which is to say that if, say, they pursued such technologies from India, or elsewhere, that would not be looked favorably upon by Russia, yes?
Military analyst strategists would be more effective to answer that question. There is an idea for the next panel, Mark.
Yes, there's no end to them, you know. Thank you, Gohar, for answering my other questions. And so the effort here has been to sort of pull back a little bit and look not at Armenia in isolation as if it is unaffected by what happens, not even in its immediate region and immediate vicinity and among countries that it borders, but also in larger regional contexts. There are, of course, other potential regional contexts that could be looked at and perhaps can be pursued in future panels. But what we've seen here certainly is that there are factors and forces that profoundly affect Armenia that exist well beyond its borders. I don't think this is something that was unknown, but it has been highly informative and to hear from those of you on the panel today possessing expertise in these regions. And I wanted to ask if any of you had any final words before we wrap up. And I wanted to again express my thanks to you for taking the time to do this today. Carter?
Thank you for the time today. I think it was a very interesting panel, and a panel that enabled me at least to think beyond Afghanistan into the wider region and how the Afghanistan withdrawal can have repercussions there. I think both some of Professor Lewis's points and Gohar's points illuminated the deeper connections that exist, especially as how the United States withdraws, that causes other countries to balance and behave differently and changes expectations, and also creates possible risks for the future. So thank you for having me today. I greatly appreciated it. And I look forward to your future panels.
Wonderful. Thank you. I would like to add, by way of conclusion, and Anna alluded to this in her introduction, the theme or the concept of this panel today emerged out of discussions that Anna and I had with Sarah Ignatius, Nasser's executive director. And I also want to thank Sarah's brother David for helping facilitate communication directly with Carter in the first place. I bring this up for several reasons, not the least of which is that some of you know, who are Nasser members and friends, that Sarah Ignatius is on the cusp of retirement after 6 years of outstanding service to Nasser as executive director. I could say too much here, and I should not do so. And I also want to say that we have, as of yesterday, have an outstanding new executive director, Silva Setrakian, from whom you will undoubtedly be hearing a great deal more in the future as well. So, but I wanted to thank Sarah for her initiative in getting us to think about this larger framework that we heard about today, and of course to Anna for having the knowledge and connections to bring together such knowledgeable panelists and to inform it with her own knowledge and moderating skills today. While I've been talking, I see several other questions have come in. I would like to ask one of them. Would Iran assist Armenia at this time, considering the highway blocked by Azerbaijan affected them, meaning Iran, in exports and perhaps imports? Would Iran assist militarily Armenia? Is that conceivable?
Իրանը պարզապես իրավունք չունի որևէ կերպ ռազմական առումով օգնել Հայաստանի Հանրապետությանը, քանի որ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության ռազմավարական դաշնակիցը միայն Ռուսաստանի Դաշնությունն է, մենք չունենք ռազմավարական պայմանագիր Իրանի հետ։
Legally, Iran is prohibited to provide such military support to Armenia simply because Armenia's security alliance is formalized with Russia.
Իրանի որևէ ռազմական աջակցություն կամ նրա զորքերի մուտքը Հայաստանի Հանրապետություն արևմուտքի կողմից դիտվելու է որպես ուրեմն սուվերեն երկրի տարածքի խախտում եւ կրկին Իրանը պատժվելու է այդ ամենի համար փաստացի։
If Iran's military presence entered Armenia, even for in terms of securing and supporting Armenia, the West will consider that as Iran breaching a border with another country, and there will be repercussions for Iran on that.
Այլ հարց է, որ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության ղեկավարությունը կարող են օգնության խնդրանքով դիմել Իրանի Իսլամական Հանրապետությանը, բայց այդ դեպքում անհասկանալի է դառնալու Ռուսաստանի Դաշնության զորքերի առկայությունը, քանի որ նա մեր ռազմավարական դաշնակիցն է։
It's a different question if Armenia requested Iran's assistance, but even that creates all kinds of challenges considering that Russia's troops, Russian soldiers are already in Armenia. So that would be complicated. Gohar, could I sort of follow up on that question and ask you as to how much diplomatic room to maneuver does Iran have relative to Russia, particularly on that North-South corridor, in which Iran is a stakeholder? Do you think U.S.-Iran relations and the nuclear negotiations, if they moved in the right direction, do you think this could create some diplomatic space for Iran? I guess what I'm asking is how much agency, independence does Iran have relative to Russia in order to protect this north-south border of connectivity, which is critical for Armenia?
Տեսնում ենք շատ հետաքրքիր մի բան տեղի ունեցավ, երբ որ արտաքին գործերի նախարար Զարիֆը պաշտոնաթոք եղավ եւ նա փաստացի Իրանում այդպես է, որ իրենք հաշվետվություն են անում եւ հենց այս հաշվետվությունը գերգաղտնի է, բայց հետաքրքիր էր, որ արտահոսք տեղ ունեցավ եւ Զարիֆը իր ելույթում նշել էր, որ ուրեմն Վիեննայի բանակցություններում ամենից շատ իրենց խոչընդոտել է հենց Ռուսաստանի Դաշնությունը, այսինքն մենք այստեղ լավ.
Wow, this is like this is fascinating. So I asked in regards to the question of Iran's agency as a diplomatic actor. So Gohad is saying that when Iran's previous Minister of Foreign Affairs was stepping down, Zarif, and they are supposed to, every minister has to issue, upon stepping down, has to issue a report, and usually those reports are secret. But in this case, some parts of the reports were leaked, and Zarif had mentioned in that report that in the nuclear negotiations, their biggest challenge was coming from Russia.
Եվ այստեղ մենք տեսնում ենք, որ ինչքան էլ Իրանի եւ Ռուսաստանի հարաբերությունները տարածաշրջանի տարբեր խնդիրներում համընկնում է, այնուամենայնիվ Ռուսաստանը եւ Իրանը եւս մրցակիցներ են տարածաշրջանում, ինչպես գազի մատակարարման առումով դեպի Եվրոպա, այնպես էլ տարածաշրջանային տարբեր խնդիրներում, դիցուք թե հենց Սիրիայում.
While on the one hand, relations between Russia and Iran cohere to a certain extent, that should not obscure the fact that there is a lot of competition that still happens between the two countries, whether it has to do in competing for European markets for gas deliveries. But you mentioned something else, go ahead, or as well as the challenges in Syria, where even though both countries are on the same side, but there are still issues on which they have to compete.
Այսինքն կարող ենք արձանագրել, որ Ռուսաստանի Դաշնությանը բավական ձեռնտու է Իրանի մեկուսացված այս վիճակը, քանի որ այս առումով են նա կարողանում բավական ազդեցություն ունենալ Ռուսաստանի Դաշնության եւ նաեւ Կովկասի նկատմամբ.
So it's safe to say that Russia is benefiting from Iran remaining somewhat isolated, because in doing so, Russia succeeds in maintaining influence over, I believe you meant Armenia, right, Gohad? Armenia and South Caucasus. Thank you. Thank you, Gohad.
Thank you too. Thank you too.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctors Ohanyan, Malkasian, Iskandarian, and Lewis. I believe we may have lost David Lewis, but nonetheless, we thank him as well for his participation and the audience for their attention. And we will be talking more about these issues and related issues in the future as they continue to affect Armenia's future developments. So thank you and have a wonderful day wherever you may be. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.